Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe was the first game I played this year, but it wasn't actually the first released. 2 weeks before Kirby's release date, Nintendo shadow dropped Metroid Prime Remastered, with the physical version hitting shelves just 2 days before Kirby. I decided to play Return to Dreamland first as I had been planning on it for longer, but I quickly moved on to my next 2023 game. My history with Metroid is fairly sparse. I played a notable amount of Super Metroid, but never made it past the plant boss. Metroid Dread was the first game I actually reached the credits of. Dread gave me an idea of what to expect from the Prime series, however I knew the gameplay would be shaken up by the Z-axis. My first game this year was my first 2D Kirby game after starting with Forgotten Land, and now my second game of 2023 is my first 3D Metroid game after starting with Dread. Weird. The Metroid series, and Metroidvanias in general, are about exploring a large interconnected map. You'll find dead ends where you can't progress anymore until you find the right item. New items open up new paths in prior areas or grant access to new ones. The games teach you to memorize the map by showing off passageways inaccessible to you the first time through an area, so you'll have an idea of where to go once you find a certain item. For example, you may find that using a Morphle bomb on a tile reveals a missile icon. You'll then know, upon obtaining the missiles, that something is hiding in that room, either a useful pickup or the path forward. Metroid Prime naturally uses the same method, displaying things like spider ball tracks or differently colored doors in plain sight so you have some idea of where to head after obtaining new items. Of course, in a restricted 2D environment, the solution can just be shoot or bomb everything and see what you spot. In a 3D, non-tile based setting, this would become strenuous quickly. Instead, Prime introduces the scan visor. Simply press right on the D-pad and any points of interest will become scannable. You can scan enemies to learn how to defeat them, or objects to learn how to interact with them. However, you can't use weaponry with the scan visor, so you'll need to be careful when scanning enemies. Whereas 2D Metroid games sometimes feel like you need to try every type of weapon on a certain type of block to see what destroys it, Prime's scan feature will tell you what a material is made of. So if you know that Bendesium disintegrates with power bombs, you won't have to guess what to use when you come upon a pile of Bendesium rubble. As the Chozo lived on the planet of Talon 4, Samus explores, and her suit is Chozo technology, the scan visor can even activate certain mechanisms, such as scanning a screen to disable auto turrets that would fire at her. This isn't the only special visor Samus can don, as you'll later discover a couple others, such as the thermal visor, which can highlight enemies and even weak points, but limits visibility. All visors simply require a tap of the D-pad to activate, and as you progress, you'll find them useful not just for spotting secrets, but for combat. If an enemy turns invisible, perhaps you just need to track their body heat. Switching between beams is almost just as quick, as these simply require holding X and tapping the D-pad. You'll of course start with the classic power beam, but along the way you'll unlock others, such as the electrical wave beam. As you may suspect, these aren't just used to open doors, but to fight different enemies. While each beam type has different effects on certain enemies, some foes can only be damaged with one type of beam. In combat, you'll need to figure out which firepower works best against your opponent, and you may have to switch between multiple beam types as you battle. Admittedly, I wasn't always fond of this mechanic while going up against normal enemies, especially when forced to fight two different types of enemies who are each only vulnerable to one type of beam. It can sometimes feel like you've no choice but to tank damage from one until you can kill the other. However, when fighting one enemy at a time, or groups of the same type of foe, the beam types add a neat little puzzle element to the combat. Where the mechanic truly shines though are boss fights. Anytime you have to experiment with different beam types to take care of a big or bad, I thoroughly enjoyed the extra bit of challenge from having to use differing weapons with differing feels. While on the topic of combat, I'll also mention that I was a bit worried about my skill set going in, as I barely any experience with first-person shooters. However, Prime adds in an auto-lock-on system, similar to the Zelda franchise and the many games inspired by it. Lock onto an enemy, and your aiming reticle will automatically align with them, so you can lock on, hide behind a pillar, and know you'll be shooting in the right direction when you jump out. This allows many encounters to be handled stealthily, a tactic I much prefer when far from any save point. As for the exploration itself, it's definitely easier to discover where you're supposed to go in Prime, as again, you don't have to lay morph bombs everywhere and hope you find a secret. For an idiot like me who's not accustomed to this style of game though, there's a nice little mechanic where after enough time has passed, you'll receive scan data. This will open up your map showing you which room you're supposed to visit next, without giving away how to get there. This is very much appreciated, as there were certainly moments where I would have found myself aimlessly wandering the entire map until I happened to accidentally stumble upon the correct location. As the game requires a lot of backtracking, this ensured I was never checking a completely different area. At least not for too long. This does bring me to a slight nitpick though. If you have the option for the scan data enabled, once it pops up you've no choice but to open the map and see it. If you reach the correct destination, it'll automatically fade away, but it'll take up a huge banner on your screen and constantly beep until you get there. It's not a big deal and the help is appreciated, but sometimes it'd pop up even when I knew where to go, because I decided to hunt for some secrets on the way there. In fact, I have a clip of scan data telling me to return to the impact crater when I was literally 2 rooms away from it. I wish there were just an option to temporarily reject the help until later, like maybe pressing plus would open the scan data, but pressing minus would make it disappear temporarily. Part of the reason I'd end up in these situations is because the game has no warp system, so any traversal to past areas is manual backtracking. I can understand wanting to encourage that in this game, as often there are extra goodies you can't get to your first time through an area, like energy takes to increase your health or missile expansions to increase your ammo. However, there are other times where I've already gotten everything I need between 2 destinations and I just want to get somewhere I've already gone. In these situations, I feel a warp system could help alleviate the pain of having to run through old areas. While I'm on a bit of a negative streak, I do have one less larger issue with the game, and it's about death. Prime isn't anywhere near Dread's difficulty level. The most any boss killed me was 2 or maybe 3 times, which I appreciated. Whereas Dread required mastery of the controls, Prime understands that your movement is a lot more complex and difficult to manage with the addition of the 3rd dimension. Combat's more focused on figuring out how to beat the boss than perfecting your dodges and aiming. However, my complaint is that there are no checkpoints between saves, and when you die you lose everything you accomplished after your last save, including upgrades and scan data. I think the lack of checkpoints is most likely due to the age of this game, originally releasing on GameCube where death was often less forgiving. I can understand where the devs were coming from deleting your scan data, as often you'll want to scan new enemies when you encounter them. The devs likely figured allowing players to keep their scan data would remove some challenge, allowing them to scan an enemy, die, and then go back in without having to worry about getting the data. But I'd argue that scanning an enemy was never once why I died. I may have taken some minor damage from first encountering a new fiend, but scanning the new enemy was never once the reason I witnessed a game overscreen. Forcing the player to rescan everything they've already investigated isn't a good punishment for losing, because it's not adding much challenge, if any at all, it's just tedium. This is most prevalent when raiding pirate hideouts. These are huge facilities with tons of things to scan. Scanning their various computers, holding tanks, and other devices is largely how Prime's story is told, revealing lore about the planet's past through the eyes of the enemy. Alongside having the most scannable items in the entire game, these are also the most dangerous areas, crawling with the toughest enemies you'll face, meaning you're more likely to die here than anywhere else on Talon 4. These bases have little to no save points, so if you do lose, you'll be set back quite a lot. I don't mind this increased tension in terms of difficulty, but these areas are why I'm so annoyed you lose all your scan data upon death. Once you've read the logs and obtained the lore, there's no reason for you to reread them, so why should we have to rescan every single thing in these pirate bases when we die? Even without checkpoints, the current punishment for death could work if you lost everything but your scan data. You still need to work your way back through all the same challenges, but you wouldn't need to stop and scan a million different things you've already obtained information from on the way. As this was a remake, I wish they had taken the time to add more quality of life features to diminish these problems. That being said, the biggest QOL feature added was the most important: new control schemes. I told myself leading up to this playthrough that I'd use motion controls 100%. I was positive that I'd either end up going with the motion control scheme or the hybrid control scheme. However, these both had setbacks I wasn't expecting. The motion option controls everything through motion, meaning your aiming reticle and camera are moving with every slight change in your hand position. While the Wii had a sensor bar to anchor itself, no such thing exists on Switch, so it all comes down to gyro. This made the motion far too finicky for me, as I was constantly having to reset it. For a game like Skyward Sword, where you're only controlling your sword or sometimes an item with motion, this is fine. In a first-person game though, when the entire camera is tied to the motion, it swivels around a lot. Hybrid is a bit better, only using motion controls when you hold the ZR button, but you're still limited to the left stick otherwise. This control scheme felt awkward to me, as Samus' direction could only be altered when aiming, and otherwise looking left or right uses classic tank controls. I was worried I ended up having to give up on the idea of motion controls and switch to the dual stick setup, but checking the options for this control scheme, I found that it even has an option for gyro. By enabling gyro, I could use the right stick to aim as God intended without giving up on the immersive quality of motion. So ironically, the best new option for motion controls is, in my opinion, the one option that leaves it out of its description entirely. While I do wish the remaster polished up some of its gameplay a bit more, there's no denying graphically and control-wise, this is the best way to experience Metroid Prime. In regards to where I'd rank it compared to Kirby, I have to say this is a tough choice. Prime had that extra bit of challenge, which I can appreciate, and the advantage of being $20 cheaper. But Kirby had more content overall. Return to Dreamland already included 4-player co-op, and an extra campaign I haven't even gotten around to yet. Deluxe then added Merry Megaland and Megalor's Epilogue 2. I enjoyed these two games about equally. They're very close for me, and I heavily debated which should be ahead. After thinking it over, I believe Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe gets the edge over Metroid. My nitpicks with Kirby were mostly having to do with external factors, like how you unlock Megalor's Epilogue, but I barely had any issues with the gameplay itself. Prime did have a few moments where I found myself annoyed by the actual gameplay. On top of that, Kirby just has more to offer. Keep in mind, I ended my Kirby review by saying if it was the weakest entry on my overall 2023 list, it would mean we had an insanely high quality year. Seeing as these two games are pretty close to the same level of quality, same goes here. Metroid Prime is an amazing game. I can see why there's so much hype behind it, and if it's the weakest entry on my 2023 list, then yeah, the year will have gone absolutely mental. Well, I finished Metroid Prime and now the review on it. And Nintendo isn't releasing anything between now and Tears of the Kingdom, so I should have enough time to squeeze in live a lot. It never ends, does it?